Good morning. I'm Ruthi Rajan, Deputy Editor of the Oath Legal Magazine. Thank you for joining the Oath GC Talk webinar series. Our webinar is in association with the law firm Charles Russell Speechlys and legal research partner LexisNexis. The pandemic has had numerous impacts and implications for projects globally and in the Middle East as well, where the development of critical social infrastructure remains key. This session looks at practical considerations and next steps to be implemented to bring projects back on track. To lead the webinar, we are pleased to have Paula Bost with us, who you can see on your screens right now. Paula is partner and head of construction, engineering, and projects in the Middle East for the firm Charles Russell Speechlys. Based in Bahrain since 2006, she specializes in construction projects throughout the region, in particular Bahrain, Oman, and Qatar. Her extensive experience includes real estate and development, infrastructure and utilities, hotels, leisure and tourism, residential, industrial, and commercial, and other key areas, both in private and public sectors. Paula acts on behalf of government and regulatory clients, including Ministry of Works, project employers and developers, lenders and investors, contractors, subcontractors, and consultants. As with every webinar, please do send in your queries to the speaker. There is also an option on the right side of your panel on both the laptop and the phone to type and send in your queries. As it's a session that's scheduled for an hour, we request you to send in queries that are relevant to our discussion today. Over to you, Paula.
Lovely, thank you, Ruthie. Good morning, everyone. I'm sure we've all had a very, very busy year as far as projects generally are concerned. So it's about time we start to have these conversations in a wider sense around getting our projects back on track. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, and thank you to the team at the Oath for organising. I've got about 30 minutes worth of slides. I'm very conscious that we've had quite a few questions come in within the last 24 hours, and I'm sure we want to use that back end of the session to make sure we're answering those questions for you in a bit more detail wherever we can. So just make a quick start. Might just need to get Ruth to help me with the slide movement.
Is it not shifting?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to want to shift. There
Okay.
we go.
Okay, let me just, shall I just share screen for you again? 1 second.
If you could do that, that'd be super helpful. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Delegates, please hold on. We'll just quickly.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Excellent.
We can see the screen. If you can.
There we go. Wonderful.
Great.
Okay. Welcome. Thanks. So we're obviously all quite conscious that there's going to be a major global impact within our industry in terms of COVID, likely earliest 2023. We have got to remember that as an industry, we are probably all firmly of the view that we have been still trying to recover in essence from the global recession, even though we are some 10, 11 years on from that. So I'm sure many of you will have seen reports from the likes of the World Bank, the IMF and MEGA, including your own interactions as businesses on a government-to-government level about what's happening, how it's happening, and what those impacts are likely to look like as an industry landscape for the next few years. We do expect, obviously, that countries where vaccine rollout it has been slower, that there will be impacts that go beyond that 2023 zone. It's not going to come as any surprise to think that they will be Asia, Africa, and the likes of South America. But those are important for us to consider in the context of our Middle East existence industry-wise, because we know that whether you're sitting at the funding, financing or employer development end of the spectrum, or indeed the contractor end, that opportunities for investment and other work in those regions is something that was very much ongoing and was very active in the Middle East region in advance of the pandemic. The key concerns that are arising for us at the moment that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis with clients essentially are the critical social infrastructure projects that are prevalent in the region, major investment projects and private financed projects where there's a degree of nervousness that has come out of recent events. And then cross-jurisdictional government-led export finance projects where the likes of UK Export Finance, for example, were storming ahead to try and secure major projects in the region and to ensure that government lending and political lending continued to increase. I mean, what we have to remember is that generally our sector is typically more volatile than other aspects of economy sectors. We do find that our linkage to GDP growth means that we are always under scrutiny, and where we are not on par or not being productive, that generally tends to make for a degree of nervousness within the corporate echelons of the sector itself and within the finance and investment arena as well. So what we're trying to see at the moment is how we move through those impacts, but we've got a little bit of a project snapshot. Most projects have not really been stopped dead in their tracks. Very few projects have actually come to an actual stop overall. What we've generally seen as a result of the unplanned and unexpected events of the last 12-18 months is really an inability to progress the works in part more than in whole. Now, there are obviously a number of projects that have had to stop, but we are seeing those as being minimal generally across the region. Employers really do want to progress projects, but there does seem to be a marked reluctance to fully acknowledge the impacts, whether within the contracting framework or within the supply chain and procurement framework. Contractors obviously want to progress as well, but in a contractor fashion, of course, there are a number who are seeing an opportunity to bring claims and to utilise the COVID landscape as a way to perhaps cover delays that existed in advance of the COVID pandemic. So I think between particularly those two last points that I raised, what we're seeing is a slight element of distrust within the sector. Between us, we've always had a divergence of interests anyway, where employers have always strived to ensure that they can save costs, and contractors are on a platform where making margin is a priority for them. So these things aren't new to the sector, but I think certainly we are seeing a heightened environment in terms of that trust relationship that exists on projects generally. I think the allegations that have come around as regards force majeure, which we'll talk about in just a second, were really in relation to impacts that were down to what we call the hard lockdown. So anything that really fell between perhaps 1st of February or 1st of March 2020 through and up to about 1st of March 2021. Are we in a soft lockdown scenario at this stage? In some jurisdictions, yes. And in some jurisdictions, it changes day to day, week to week and month to month. So we're still really very much living under the grey cloud of restrictions and hindrance to progress generally. What are we seeing on the ground? Nothing on this list is probably going to come as a major surprise to many of you. The suspension and omissions of work are very prevalent. We're seeing calls on bonds and guarantees in the market. There's been an increase in those, some justified, some perhaps more attuned to the fact that it's seen as potentially easy cash flow in some situations. And that leads into the fact that there is a cash flow problem. Non-payment, late payment. Many people will say these were issues we had before the pandemic. Has the impact of the pandemic exacerbated them? The answer is in reality, absolutely yes. We're seeing enhanced contractor claims, delay, disruption, prolongation, the whole spectrum. But we're seeing more of those, including things like standby costs and demobilisation, remobilisation on a scale that we would not ordinarily have seen before. Supply chain and procurement has been a subject of huge debate, and there are difficulties, not just around the traditional long lead items that we talk about in the market, but there are questions to be asked over general resilience and ability to fortify those supply chains so that we are better prepared next time around, and that we can deal with those issues much more efficiently than we have done. We're seeing obviously increased health and safety measures on site. We've still got social distancing in play. Some sites are capable of having more people than others, and again, it's very much jurisdiction led. In terms of border restrictions, linked in a little bit to those supply chain and procurement issues, we're seeing embargoes and blockades, and that terminology then finds its way into the arguments that are being raised in relation to force majeure and in relation to those contractor claims that we're seeing coming back up through the chain. We're going to see an end across the board to the government support and economic assistance has come about in the last 12 to 18 months, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like and what it means in reality. And as I've touched on before, we are living under this slight grey cloud at the moment of further restrictions and waiting to see what the next steps, next impacts, etc. will be. So in terms of sector specifics, I think really the project specific sector we've been left to sort it out for ourselves to a large extent. We need to point fingers backwards at ourselves and say that we really did not see this coming. I don't see evidence that there was any major critical business planning undertaken in advance of February, March 2020 by the industry. And certainly one would have expected perhaps an uptick in contract administration to better deal with it. But again, for the most part, that has continued to be fairly lacking. In terms of the economic support measures then, employer to contractor payments have seen very, very little economic support government side. It's really more been about support for workers and the insurance and furlough schemes. We would really have benefited, I think, at government level from employer to contractor payment support, procurement and supply chain support, particularly where we have got such reliance in the region on our transport and logistics arrangements. And then, of course, economic support in terms of those sites which were compelled for various reasons to actually close. That focus on support for workers, as helpful as it has been very minimal and has been very national driven. So it's very much geared towards protecting Emiratis, Bahrainis, Qataris, Saudis, etc., etc. So that's not really helped the industry generally, and it really is probably down to the fact that we do have a fairly unique employee expat spectrum. We do have a large range of workers who don't fall into those nationalist categories, and therefore there's really been no focus on ensuring that they are supported through the pandemic in the way that we have seen, in particular in the European and in the Americas. We are getting allegations of employers and engineers, and I'm using a variety of terms here that have come across the board from clients at my side. They use the word delaying, hindering, obstructing, ignoring contractor claims. Whatever category you want to put that dialogue, communication and collaboration into, at the end of the day, it still arises out of the COVID-related delays. And it comes, I think, from a sense of confusion and frustration on the employer developer side and also the engineering consultancy side. There's a fear factor that's coming into play, which is that they don't know which claims are valid or not. They don't really understand force majeure and how it operates and how it's different from country to country and from project to project, because it's very much factually led. I think it also comes out of the fact that there's a bit of a, I wouldn't call it a blame game per se, but there's an acknowledgement that there's a comparable line of suffering going on across the board in terms of loss and damage. And correlating the two of those commercially has been difficult, I think, at all levels of the construction business. So for an employer to say, I don't need to pay my contractor because I can't afford it, and actually I'm suffering as well. The contractor is saying, well, you should be paying me because if you don't, I'm going to go bust. Those are difficult conversations when the parties on both sides of the fence are both suffering, maybe in different ways, but it is having an impact generally at the end of the day on the project that they're working on between them. In terms of the regulation and legislation changes, they've not been widespread in terms of what we would call pure law. We've seen a lot of directives, a lot of mandates, a lot of regulatory tweaks for compliance and adherence purposes, mostly geared in the health and safety arena, but they relate predominantly to private sector and not really so much to the public sector. And they go to the heart really of project operations, because the impacts that they have really do come down and bear down on the day-to-day operational aspects of a live project and works that is being carried out on site. We all talk about force majeure, and there have been plenty of conversations around what it is, how it works, what the impacts are. And in reality, for us across the region, it differs from country to country. Civil law treats COVID very differently to the common law jurisdictions as well. And here it's going to be very much proof-led at the end of the day, and it's going to come down to contemporaneous records and the ability to carry out probably very detailed delay analysis with claims support documentation. The major issue that we do have is that most of the force majeure clauses that we're circulating in the market don't actually provide a specific line of relief by specifically capturing COVID as a force majeure event. We see some contracts which do have references to a pandemic or perhaps other type of widespread illness scenario. But even if they are captured to a certain extent, what we do see is that they are then narrowed in terms of the ability to claim and the grounds of relief. And that's in two respects, really. We get a risk reduction side of that for the employer, i.e. sensible measures, certain things you should do, a reasonable approach, if you like, to how that will go forward. But what you get from the contracting side is this requirement for enhanced mitigation, essentially. And there is an argument to be had that the balance of fairness that sits in those force majeure clauses is really quite imbalanced. So where do we get to? In really simple terms, we get to a scenario where there may be a granting of time, but there is highly unlikely to be a granting of money or cost in relation to that extension of time. So whilst the laws across the Middle East jurisdictions are also differing in terms of entitlement and relief on force majeure, the courts are also coming up with different scenarios on that as well. Now, we've got great displays in the European courts and jurisdictions about the impacts of COVID generally. And the force majeure, they're putting it under the contractual definition of pandemic, where they have one in those contracts. But they don't, or they seem reluctant to give us any guidance or precedent that we could rely on, which would show that a force majeure event entitles contractors to both time and costs. Now, from a funding financier and employer end of the spectrum, that is positive. From the contracting, subcontracting, supply chain end of the spectrum, not so positive. So there are a multitude of considerations here in terms of the court's reluctance to be helpful. We do have what I view as being a let's wait and see approach, and I do think that is hindering sensible contract administration at the moment. I do think it is having a massive impact on claims management generally. And what we don't want to see is that let's wait and see approach then sees an escalation to formal disputes, which we should, in theory, with all of the right tools and the right professional consultants in the region, we should be able to drive towards sensible final account settlements and amicable settlements wherever we can. But ultimately, what it's going to come down to is that claims are going to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. That seems to be the direct strategy at the moment. We don't want them to become formal disputes. But we do need to see a shift, particularly within the consultancy professions, so that they are more definitive with their employer clients about what is force majeure, where are the causes and effects of those events within the timeline over the COVID period between 2020 and 2021. that lack of understanding is something that needs enhancing. There needs to be some education. There needs to be more discussion. We're currently running, for example, a series of workshops for one major contractor client. And as part of that, we've brought in the employer professional team into that as well. So it's more of a partnering and collaboration approach so that everyone can understand the force majeure landscape better. And therefore it better equips them and tools them up to deal with the claims regimes. We're seeing a distinct lack of substantive evidence. We've never been the most productive industry for the creation of records. It's always been something that has held us back. Some contractors, subcontractors, supply chain are much better at it than others. And I wouldn't say even there's much differentiation between global and international contractors and those on a more localized scale. It really has, in certainly the last 5 to 6 years, come down as a matter of a resource issue and a shortage of skill within the market generally. We don't have enough people to do the job that needs to be done to create the substantive evidence, to either provide support for claims or on the flip side, to have sufficient team geared up to evaluate those claims when they come in. So we have pre-existing issues in advance of the pandemic, which are continuing to have an impact at this stage. Is there a lack of an inclination to deal? I alluded earlier to this fear factor idea. I think professional teams are concerned about putting their foot down or providing advice to employer clients who may say, look, these claims are valid, you're going to have to deal with them. At the very least, we're going to have to look at them and consider them under the normal contractual nuances. But that lack of inclination is going to have to be dealt with head on if we're going to progress through to completion on the majority of projects and take that up with a view to avoiding formal disputes at the end of the day, which is the end goal. None of us want to be in disputes that we could have simply avoided if possible. And I think there's also then a lack of funding to cover these additional claims. And that goes back to the fact that unexpected, unplanned events which have given rise from a cause and effect perspective, where there are valid claim established, there's going to have to be additional funding to cover those claim costs. And that is not an easy conversation for the corporate side of the construction industry to then have. The funding and finance and investment clients out there will be concerned about what that additional funding is going to look like and how much it's going to cost and whether it's feasibly available actually in the market. In terms of changes in law, this has probably been the one arena where we've seen in particular contractors hanging their hats. I'm giving you a little list there of the types of changes in law that they have been particularly concerned about. The enforced site closures and lockdowns, access are a big one. But the enhanced health and safety measures, particularly including changes to worker accommodation, have seen a widespread level of changes, particularly at a municipality and directive level in each of our jurisdictions. The supply chain delays was definitive about what they view that supply chain delay as meaning from an international or localized or regional perspective. So the language is very, very different. And then, of course, we have the issue as to workers generally and our visa restrictions, quarantine requirements, whether that applies to expat workforce, migrant labour workforce, or just general localized workforce on the ground country to country, whether it was already here in advance of the pandemic commencing or whether it was en route here to bolster and provide on the ground support to projects that were about to start. Either way, those changes in law, if we can refer to them generally as that, result in a prevention in performance of the works. And again, I reference as to whether that may be in whole or in part. And this predominantly will make up really of impacts, and we have to look at cause and effect. We have to look at records within the contract makeup. We have to look at that contract administration as a minimum standard industry practice. But we're really not seeing any increase in the efficiency of that contract administration. which is slightly disappointing because we've been trying to reinforce the message that records across the board for all parties is really going to make the difference on how we restart projects, remobilize, reprogram, change up from original baselines, etc., and really try and take things forward towards project completion. So we see a number of arguments that then also come into play on the changes in law side. Do they amount to measures which became accepted risks or were accepted as accepted risks as at the time, is one major argument. Is it force majeure only when the event is out of either party's control or unforeseeable as per a traditional force majeure approach? And then the question is, when did it become foreseeable and when was it controllable? So the magic date in everyone's mind seems to be 1st of February or 1st of March 2020. But the question as to how long events continue to cause and effect for is essentially one of a project to project basis. And the timing really here is an issue overall, and consideration of cause and effect coupled with changes in law, or even items that won't be deemed changes in law because they were of much more low-level localized perspective, really needs to be taken into consideration when we're looking at an analysis of overall impacts. So what I would say is we don't think that CIL is actually the safety net that many thought it would be. And when I say many, I think particularly at the contracting and subcontracting end of the spectrum, which is where there's a lot of reliance at the moment. So in terms of a renewed focus, obviously it's all about bringing projects back on track, but there's more that is coming into play as part of that. We've got to ensure adherence to corporate due diligence. At the end of the day, projects are money-making or asset-generating endeavours, and the corporate side of that is imperative. Maintaining funding and finance or seeking renewal is an active exercise now across the region and indeed globally. That continued adherence to government regulations, requirements, new legislation, if that's what we have, is absolutely paramount. And there's much more monitoring and control going on within governments and on the localised public sector side to make sure that that is being done. But really, it's about getting projects to completion, and it's an as soon as possible scenario to try and make up for the delays and impacts that we've experienced in the last 18 months. So we talk about some practical considerations around this then. We've got these steps that we are seeing coming up for review and implementation client side. And first on top of that list really is a reminder in terms of notifications and updates to insurers and funders. They are the people who will keep the operation of projects in full flow, and the importance of notifying and updating them really can't be understated. We'll find also that in many jurisdictions, the project documentation that has been entered into with funders will have requirements around those notifications and updates, which will then lead to ensuring a continuity of funding. Similarly with insurers, we don't want to see insurance policies lapsing or falling to one side just as a result of the fact that the right notice or the right update was not sent in a timely or prompt and honest manner. I think the other thing that comes off of that then in terms of the honesty side is giving accurate reflections to those insurers and those funders, and giving accurate reflections in particular about how it's going to move down the line as we push through. Similarly, considerations abound in that regard for shareholders and boards of directors. Investors will want to see what has happened, what is now happening, what the plan is moving forward. And that's incredibly important. And that will also come into play where we talk about critical business planning and business continuity reviews, which are now mightily ongoing in the majority of entities across the region. Project recommencement plans and revised programs. These are all great. Re-triggers are great. Remobilization is great. There has to be a reality check conversation on many projects around those that were already experiencing delays in advance of the COVID pandemic. The other issue that we've always had in region as a sector generally is whether or not those baseline programs, critical paths, and programs for activity were ever really realistic in the beginning of the project. So this is a good time for a reevaluation of what that recommencement looks like, what those revised programs look like, and how they correlate with the original baselines that you started your project on. Supply chain reviews sounds terribly generic, can refer to anything from a review of the contracts that are in play within that supply chain, but also looking at the fortification and the resilience of that supply chain going forward. We know from what has happened in the last 18 months that the system was not as solid as we needed it to be. What comes out of that is, will we take a lessons learned approach, and will we try and secure alternative supply chain, backup supply chain, maybe better digitally driven methods of mapping our supply chain and procurement processes. So I think supply chain is really a key arena for the industry, and a review is going to take more than one form, and it's going to be made up of more than one type of review. In terms of site safety and liability, I think the feedback and response from the market in relation to that and adapting to particular changes to worker accommodation and enhancements to those has been a very, very positive one. And there are a number of aspects there that have been addressed, which have been raised by many construction professionals in the last few years regarding site safety and liability. Does it go as far as we'd all like it to see? Probably not quite yet, but it's certainly much better and much more rigid in its enforcement than it was previously. I think site safety and liability will continue to headline, and health and safety does seem to have moved up the ranks in terms of a key project priority, which is no bad thing. Contracts and subcontract risk reviews, certainly looking as a minimum at extensions to defect liability periods, but also extensions to product warranties and guarantees is another big arena that is coming up. The liquidated damages aspect of existing contracts and subcontract reviews is also an arena that has been looked at quite heavily on the employer side. Can there be some collaboration and proactivity between contracting parties as to the implication of LDs and delay damages against contractors in light of the COVID pandemic? I think there will be some collaboration on that front, and I think there probably should be. I think it will assist in easing the economic damage and loss that has been caused to date, and it will go some way towards rebuilding that platform of trust that I had mentioned just at the beginning of this session. But in general, overall terms, are we going to see a complete renegotiation and renewal on contracts? No, I don't think we are, and I don't think we necessarily need to. But the key arena within contracts and subcontracts that I know is concerning the majority of contractors, and then this applies to supply chain as well, is pricing. A huge fluctuation and increases across the board in relation to construction materials. And I do think there probably needs to be a reality check around what that pricing now looks like, particularly if you consider that many projects on the Middle East landscape were priced 3, 4, some 5, 6 years ago. We're really, really very far on now from those original pricing strategies. But then that goes back to the funding and financing and investment side of the spectrum as well, and how much is going to be available in market to try and see our way to making that more comfortable and feasible. Security reviews, I alluded to the pulling on performance bonds and guarantees as an easy method of some cash flow. Certainly it's given rise to, I would say, an increased number of localized court proceedings on those bonds and guarantees. And it's unfortunate that some projects have come to that position. But again, I think it's back to that more knowledge in terms of force majeure generally, more knowledge about the cause and effect in relation to the claims arena. And I think between the employers and contractors and construction professionals, there will start to be a settling down in relation to the performance bond and guarantee side of things. Those security reviews really do need to include the banks and funding institutions. We need to make sure that extensions can be agreed that are realistic, and again, need to tie in then with those recommencement plans and those revised programs or enhanced baselines that will come into play. I do think we need a contract administration review and a protocol update generally within projects. I had thought that perhaps the pandemic would spur the contracting and subcontracting fraternity into more action on that front. That's not really come about, and I think many are now going to struggle unless they put dedicated teams into play to pull together those records that are going to be so necessarily required to ensure that their claims are properly substantiated and capable of being properly evaluated by engineers in the market. In terms of those reviews and protocols themselves, there's always been room for improvement, and I don't think most of the project management teams and engineering teams in the region will be able to sit back and say there's nothing they can do, because I think there's a lot they can do to enhance this, and it would prove to be a game changer in terms of how we deal with, drive, manage, determine, and essentially risk assess the claims that are going to arise or already arising from the COVID pandemic across the board. Even if the result of those exercises is to say to a contractor, we've looked at your claim, it's not valid, we're terribly sorry, or you don't have the right records, etc., etc. So I think there's a huge amount of work to do on that contract administration side at the moment. In terms of claims and disputes, then that really ties in with that contract administration review and protocol update. And it's really just down to proper preparation and its effective management and evaluation at the end of the day. All of this then ties in as well to the ability to be able to properly notify and update insurers, funders, shareholders, boards of directors and investors. This all ties in together. It's important information as regards the life cycle of the project. We do aim for dispute avoidance and amidst project completion. That's always the end game. No one wants to finish the project on a major dispute. And I think all of these things that come into play will gear most parties towards actively ensuring that their teams are aligned across the board in terms of achieving that strategy. I've touched on the critical business planning side and the business continuity reviews. They obviously differ from entity to entity in terms of what's required and the extent to which various businesses will go to. We do obviously have lots of corporate governance structuring now across the jurisdictions in the Middle East, and there is an adherence required to those standards, whether it's through ministries of industry and commerce or otherwise. So in terms of those items, they're just some quick practical considerations around the restart on projects, things to think about. And what we're also going to see is probably an element of enhancement as we move towards a more innovative construction industry following the pandemic. We've got to get more digitalized. We've got to make better use of the technology. The working from home aspect will continue for many, in particular construction professionals, employers and funding side. But we do still have to consider the fact that we are a very heavy on-site driven business. And can we take some aspects of that on-site work, move it off-site? We've seen lots of manoeuvres in the last 5-6 years towards BIM modelling, fabrication processes and modular construction becoming very, very popular. And that is probably likely set to continue as we move forward. So we have an opportunity to probably rethink things a little bit as we restart our projects and gear back up again towards driving those over the line to completion. So it's going to be an interesting and busy time, I think, for many of us at all levels of the project's world. So that's just some thoughts from me in relation to the impacts of COVID and as we move forward and restarting our projects. We do obviously have much to discuss. That very much goes without saying, and I'm sure the Oath have lined up a whole raft of follow-up seminars for you along the same lines. But I'm conscious now to try and deal with some of your questions if we have any of those at the moment. And I'll pass back to Ruthie because she's in charge of the question sharing with me, and we'll try and deal with those for you. I think while we're just waiting on those questions coming in, a couple of long lead comments that we've had in from the client side, certainly in the last 2 to 3 months. Some clients are saying, I don't know where to start, which bit's more important, where's the priority? And I think the answer is, even if you take the practical considerations list that's contained in the slides, I think the priority for you on an individual project really depends on the project, depends on your project structure, it depends on your invested stakeholders. I suppose it depends on the criticality of that project as well. So as boring as it sounds, it's a case-by-case, project-by-project analysis that needs to be carried out essentially from one business to another. Ruthie, I don't think we're having any questions coming through, so yeah. I think probably in line with that, if there are no questions, then we're happy to wrap up this morning.
Okay, delegates, if you have any questions, you can send them through. Of course, Paula would be more than happy to look into them. So
absolutely, maybe, yeah, absolutely, yeah, happy to take those.
Yeah. So if there are any questions, maybe you can just wait a few seconds. Otherwise, we can wrap up for the day if that's all right. Okay, so thank you, Paula, for your practical insight on the crucial topic.
You're very welcome.
Like we said, if there are any questions, we, kindly do send it to us, so we can, or you can reach out to Paula directly as well, and she'd be more than happy to take them for you. And as Paula mentioned, based on what we've discussed today, if there are any sort of follow-up events that we can look into, we will definitely look into it. You can send us your suggestions, and that's something we can discuss as well. So thank you so much, Paula, for sharing your practical insight with us this morning. I know it's hard to cover this topic in an hour, but I think you've done an excellent job to cover the most important parts of these of the next steps that everybody should be considering. So thank you so much. Our sincere thanks to the firm Charles Russell Speechlys for leading the discussion. To the extended team at the firm, Emma and Jessica, thank you for your help in organizing the session. We would also like to thank our legal research partner, LexisNexis, for their support. And of course, to my colleagues at Niche Publishers, especially to Sandhya, co-organizer of this session, for your support this morning. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Oath magazine's website. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I wish you good health and a wonderful week. Thank you once again, Paula. God bless. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruthie.